A overthrow of cooperation based on handicraft and on the division of labor, we have seen how machinery does away with cooperation based on handicrafts, and with manufacture based on the division of handicraft labor. An example of the first sort is the mowing machine. It replaces cooperation between mowers. A striking example of the second kind is the needle-making machine. According to Adam Smith, men in his day made in cooperation over needles a day. On the other hand, a single needle machine makes, in a working day of hours, one woman or one girl superintends 4 such machines, and so produces near upon needles in a day and upwards of in a week. A single machine, when it takes the place of cooperation or of manufacture, may itself serve as the basis of an industry of a handicraft character. Still, such a return to handicrafts is but a transition to the factory system, which, as a rule, makes its appearance so soon as the human muscles are replaced, for the purpose of driving the machines, by a mechanical motive power, such as steam or water. Here and there, but in any case only for a time, an industry may be carried on a small scale, by means of mechanical power. This is effected by hiring steam power, as is done in some of the Birmingham trades, or by the use of small caloric engines, as in some branches of weaving. In the Coventry silk weaving industry, the experiment of cottage factories was tried. In the center of a square surrounded by rows of cottages, an engine house was built, and the engine connected by shafts with the looms in the cottages. In all cases the power was hired at so much per loom. The rent was payable weekly, whether the looms worked or not. Each cottage held from 2 looms, some belonged to the weaver, some were bought on credit, some were hired. The struggle between these cottage factories and the factory proper lasted over years. It ended with the complete ruin of the cottage factories. Wherever the nature of the process did not involve production on a large scale, the new industries that have sprung up in the last few decades, such as envelope making, steel pen making, and have, as a general rule, first passed through the handicraft stage, and then the manufacturing stage, as short phases of transition to the factory stage. The transition is very difficult in those cases where the production of the article by manufacture consists, not of a series of graduated processes, but of a great number of disconnected ones. This circumstance formed a great hindrance to the establishment of steel pen factories. Nevertheless, about years ago, a machine was invented that automatically performed separate operations at once. The first steel pens were supplied by the handicraft system in the year at £. The gross in they were supplied by manufacture at, and today the factory system supplies them to the trade at from 2. The gross b reaction of the factory system on manufacture and domestic industries, along with the development of the factory system and of the revolution in agriculture that accompanies it, production in all the other branches of industry not only extends, but alters its character. The principle, carried out in the factory system, of analyzing the process of production into its constituent phases, and of solving the problems thus proposed by the application of mechanics, of chemistry, and of the whole range of the natural sciences, becomes the determining principle everywhere. Hence, machinery squeezes itself into the manufacturing industries first for one detail process, then for another. Thus the solid crystal of their organization, based on the old division of labor, becomes dissolved, and makes way for constant changes. Independently of this, a radical change takes place in the composition of the collective laborer, a change of the persons working in combination. In contrast with the manufacturing period, the division of labor is thenceforth based, wherever possible, on the employment of women, of children of all ages, and of unskilled laborers, in one word, on cheap labor, as it is characteristically called in England. This is the case not only with all production on a large scale, whether employing machinery or not, but also with the so-called domestic industry, whether carried on in the houses of the workpeople or in small workshops. This modern so-called domestic industry has nothing, except the name, in common with the old-fashioned domestic industry, the existence of which presupposes independent urban handicrafts, independent peasant farming, and above all, a dwelling house for the laborer and his family. That old-fashioned industry has now been converted into an outside department of the factory, the manufactory, or the warehouse. Besides the factory operatives, the manufacturing workmen and the handicraftsmen, whom it concentrates in large masses at one spot, and directly commands, Kapital also sets in motion, by means of invisible threads, another army, that of the workers in the domestic industries, who dwell in the large towns and are also scattered over the face of the country. An example, the shirt factory of Messrs. Tilly at Londonderry, which employs operatives in the factory itself, and people spread up and down the country and working in their own houses. The exploitation of cheap and immature labor power is carried out in a more shameless manner in modern manufacture than in the factory proper. This is because the technical foundation of the factory system, namely, the substitution of machines for muscular power and the light character of the labor, is almost entirely absent in manufacture. And at the same time, women and overyoung children are subjected, in a most unconscionable way, to the influence of poisonous or injurious substances. This exploitation is more shameless in the so-called domestic industry than in manufactures, and that because the power of resistance in the laborers decreases with their dissemination, because a whole series of plundering parasites insinuate themselves between the employer and the workman, because a domestic industry has always to compete either with the factory system or with manufacturing in the same branch of production, because poverty robs the workman of the conditions most essential to his labor, of space, light, and ventilation, because employment becomes more and more irregular, and finally, because in these the last resorts of the masses made redundant by modern industry and agriculture, competition for work attains its maximum. Economy in the means of production, first systematically carried out in the factory system, and there, from the very beginning, coincident with the most reckless squandering of labor power, and robbery of the conditions normally requisite for labor. This economy now shows its antagonistic and murderous side more and more in a given branch of industry, the less the social productive power of labor and the technical basis for a combination of processes are developed in that branch. See modern manufacture. It is impossible for a child to pass through the purgatory of a tile field without great moral degradation, the low language which they are accustomed to hear from their tenderest years, the filthy, indecent, and shameless habits amidst which, unknowing and half-wild, they grow up, make them in afterlife lawless, abandoned, dissolute. A frightful source of demoralization is the mode of living. Each molder, who is always a skilled laborer, and the chief of a group, supplies his subordinates with board and lodging in his cottage. Whether members of his family or not, the men, boys, and girls all sleep in the cottage, which contains generally 2 exceptionally rooms, all on the ground floor and badly ventilated. These people are so exhausted after the day's hard work that neither the rules of health, of cleanliness, nor of decency are in the least observed. Many of these cottages are models of untidiness, dirt, and dust. The greatest evil of the system that employs young girls on this sort of work consists in this, that, as a rule, it chains them fast from childhood for the whole of their afterlife to the most abandoned rabble. They become rough, foul-mouthed boys before nature has taught them that they are women. Clothed in a few dirty rags, the legs naked far above the knees, hair and face besmeared with dirt, they learn to treat all feelings of decency and of shame with contempt. During meal times they lie at full length in the fields, or watch the boys bathing in a neighboring canal. Their heavy day's work at length completed, they put on better clothes and accompany the men to the public houses. That excessive insobriety is prevalent from childhood upwards among the whole of this class is only natural. The worst is that the brickmakers despair of themselves. You might as well, said one of the better kind to a chaplain of Southfield, try to raise and improve the devil as a bricky, sir. As to the manner in which capital affects an economy in the requisites of labor, in modern manufacture, official and most ample material bearing on it is to be found in the Public Health Reports IV. and VI. The description of the workshops, more especially those of the London printers and tailors, surpasses the most loathsome fantasies of our romance writer. The effect on the health of the workpeople is self-evident. Dr. Simon, the chief medical officer of the Privy Council and the official editor of the Public Health Reports, says, this progress in the rate of consumption ought to suffice for the most optimist of progressists, and for the biggest hawker of lies among the free trade bagmen of Germany. It is not at all uncommon in Nottingham to find children huddled together in a small room, of perhaps not more than feet square, and employed for hours out of at work that of itself is exhausting, from its weariness and monotony, and is besides carried on under every possible unwholesome condition. Even the very youngest children work with a strained attention and a rapidity that is astonishing, hardly ever giving their fingers rest or glowering their motion. If a question be asked them, they never raise their eyes from their work from fear of losing a single moment. The long stick is used by the mistresses as a stimulant more and more as the working hours are prolonged. The children gradually tire and become as restless as birds towards the end of their long detention at an occupation that is monotonous, eye-straining, and exhausting from the uniformity in the posture of the body. Their work is like slavery. When women and their children work at home, which nowadays means in a hired room, often in a garret, the state of things is, if possible, still worse. This sort of work is given out within a circle of miles radius from Nottingham. On leaving the warehouses at or o'clock at night, the children are often given a bundle of lace to take home with them and finish. The Pharisee of a capitalist, represented by one of his servants, accompanies this action, of course, with the unctuous phrase, "That's for mother." Yet he knows well enough that the poor children must sit up and help. The smaller of these numbers, says one of the commissioners, Mr. White, represents less space than the half of what a child would occupy if packed in a box measuring feet in each direction. It is no wonder that ignorance and vice abound in a population so brought up. Their morality is at the lowest ebb. A great number of the women have illegitimate children, and that at such an immature age that even those most conversant with criminal statistics are astounded. And the native land of these model families is the pattern Christian country for Europe, so says at least Count Montalembert, certainly a competent authority on Christianity. Wages in the above industries, miserable as they are reduced far below their nominal amount by the prevalence of the truck system everywhere, but especially in the lace districts. The passage of modern manufacture and domestic industry into modern mechanical industry. The hastening of this revolution by the application of the factory acts to those industries the cheapening of labor power, by sheer abuse of the labor of women and children, by sheer robbery of every normal condition requisite for working and living, and by the sheer brutality of overwork and night work, meets at last with natural obstacles that cannot be overstepped. So also, when based on these methods, do the cheapening of commodities and capitalist exploitation in general. So soon as this point is at last reached, and it takes many years, the hour has struck for the introduction of machinery, and for the thenceforth rapid conversion of the scattered domestic industries and also of manufactures into factory industry. An example, on the most colossal scale, of this movement is afforded by the production of wearing apparel. This industry, according to the classification of the Children's Employment Commission, comprises straw hat makers, ladies' hat makers, cap makers, tailors, milliners and dressmakers, shirt makers, corset makers, glove makers, shoemakers, besides many minor branches, such as the making of neckties, collars, and the number of females employed in these industries in England and Wales amounted to, of these at the least were under years of age. The number of these workwomen in the United Kingdom was the number of males employed in England and Wales, in hat-making, shoemaking, glove-making, and tailoring was, of these under years, between and over years. Many of the smaller branches are not included in these figures. But take the figures as they stand. We then have for England and Wales alone, according to the census of a total of persons, about as many as are absorbed by agriculture and cattle breeding. We begin to understand what becomes of the immense quantities of goods conjured up by the magic of machinery, and of the enormous masses of workpeople, which that machinery sets free. The raw material, is supplied by mechanical industry. The mass of cheap human material is composed of the individuals by mechanical industry and improved agriculture. The manufactures of this class owed their origin chiefly to the capitalist's need of having at hand an army ready, equipped to meet any increase of demand. These manufactures, nevertheless, allowed the scattered handicrafts and domestic industries to continue to exist as a broad foundation. The great production of surplus value in these branches of labor and the progressive cheapening of their articles were and are chiefly due to the minimum wages paid, no more than requisite for a miserable vegetation, and to the extension of working time up to the maximum endurable by the human organism. It was in fact by the cheapness of the human sweat and the human blood, which were converted into commodities, that the markets were constantly being extended, and continue daily to be extended. More especially was this the case with England's colonial markets, where besides, English tastes and habits prevail. At last the critical point was reached. The basis of the old method, sheer brutality in the exploitation of the workpeople, accompanied more or less by a systematic division of labor, no longer sufficed for the extending markets and for the still more rapidly extending competition of the capitalist. The hour struck for the advent of machinery. The decisively revolutionary machine, the machine which attacks in an equal degree the whole of the numberless branches of this sphere of production, dressmaking, tailoring, shoemaking, sewing, hat-making, and many others, is the sewing machine. Its immediate effect on the workpeople is like that of all machinery, which, since the rise of modern industry, has seized upon new branches of trade. Children of too tender an age are sent adrift. The wage of the machine hands rises compared with that of the houseworkers, many of whom belong to the poorest of the poor. That of the better situated handicraftsmen, with whom the machine competes, sinks. The new machine hands are exclusively girls and young women. With the help of mechanical force, they destroy the monopoly that male labor had of the heavier work, and they drive off from the lighter work numbers of old women and very young children. The overpowering competition crushes the weakest of the manual laborers. The fearful increase in death from starvation during the last years in London runs parallel with the extension of machine sewing. The new workwomen turn the machines by hand and foot, or by hand alone, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing, according to the weight, size, and special make of the machine, and expend a great deal of labor power. Their occupation is unwholesome, owing to the long hours, although in most cases they are not so long as under the old system. Wherever the sewing machine locates itself in narrow and already overcrowded workrooms, it adds to the unwholesome influences. The effect, says Mr. Lord, on entering low-ceiled workrooms in which the machine hands are working is unbearable. The heat, partly due to the gas stoves used for warming the irons, is horrible. Even when moderate hours of work, from in the morning till in the evening, prevail in such places, yet or persons fall into a swoon regularly every day. The revolution in the industrial method, which is the necessary result of the revolution in the instruments of production, is effected by a medley of transition forms. These forms vary according to the extent to which the sewing machine has become prevalent in one branch of industry or the other, to the time during which it has been in operation, to the previous condition of the workpeople, to the preponderance of manufacture, of handicrafts, or of domestic industry, to the rent of the workrooms. And in dressmaking, for instance, where the labor for the most part was already organized, chiefly by simple cooperation. The sewing machine at first formed merely a new factor in that manufacturing industry. In tailoring, shirt-making, shoemaking, and all the forms are intermingled. Here the factory system proper. Their middlemen receive the raw material from the capitalist end chef and group around their sewing machines, in chambers and garrets, from 2 or more workwomen. Finally, as is always the case with machinery when not organized into a system, and when it can also be used in dwarfish proportions, handicraftsmen and domestic workers, along with their families, or with a little extra labor from without, make use of their own sewing machine. The system actually prevalent in England is that the capitalist concentrates a large number of machines on his premises, and then distributes the produce of those machines for further manipulation amongst the domestic workers. The variety of the transition forms, however, does not conceal the tendency to conversion into the factory system proper. This tendency is nurtured by the very nature of the sewing machine, the manifold uses of which push on the concentration, under one roof and one management, of previously separated branches of a trade. It is also favored by the circumstance that preparatory needlework and certain other operations are most conveniently done on the premises where the machine is at work, as well as by the inevitable expropriation of the hand sewers and of the domestic workers who work with their own machine. This fate has already in part overtaken them. The constantly increasing amount of capital invested in sewing machines gives the spur to the production of, and gluts the markets with, machine-made articles, thereby giving the signal to the domestic workers for the sale of their machine. The overproduction of sewing machines themselves causes their producers, in bad want of a sale, to let them out for so much a week, thus crushing by their deadly competition the small owners of machines. Constant changes in the construction of the machines, and their ever-increasing cheapness, depreciate day by day the older makes, and allow of their being sold in great numbers at absurd prices to large capitalists, who alone can thus employ them at a profit. Finally, the substitution of the steam engine for man gives in this, as in all similar revolutions, the finishing blow. At first, the use of steam power meets with mere technical difficulties, such as unsteadiness in the machines, difficulty in controlling their speed, rapid wear and tear of the lighter machines, and all of which are soon overcome by experience. If, on the one hand, the concentration of many machines in large manufactories leads to the use of steam power, on the other hand, the competition of steam with human muscles hastens on the concentration of workpeople and machines in large factories. Thus England is at present experiencing, not only in the colossal industry of making wearing apparel, but in most of the other trades mentioned above, the conversion of manufacture, of handicrafts, and of domestic work into the factory system, after each of those forms of production, totally changed and disorganized under the influence of modern industry, has long ago reproduced, and even overdone, all the horrors of the factory system. without participating in any of the elements of social progress it contains. This industrial revolution, which takes place spontaneously, is artificially helped on by the extension of the factory acts to all industries in which women, young persons, and children are employed. The compulsory regulation of the working day as regards its length, pauses, beginning and end, the system of relays of children, the exclusion of all children under a certain age, and necessitate on the one hand more machinery and the substitution of steam as a motive power in the place of muscle. On the other hand, in order to make up for the loss of time, an expansion occurs of the means of production used in common, of the furnaces, buildings, and, in one word, greater concentration of the means of production and a correspondingly greater concourse of workpeople. The chief objection, repeatedly and passionately urged on behalf of each manufacturer threatened with the Factory Act, is in fact this, that in order to continue the business on the old scale, a greater outlay of capital will be necessary. But as regards labor in the so-called domestic industries and the intermediate forms between them and manufacture, so soon as limits are put to the working day and to the employment of children, those industries go to the wall. Unlimited exploitation of cheap labor power is the sole foundation of their power to compete. One of the essential conditions for the existence of the factory system, especially when the length of the working day is fixed, is certainty in the result. The production in a given time of a given quantity of commodities or of a given useful effect. The statutory pauses in the working day, moreover, imply the assumption that periodical and sudden cessation of the work does no harm to the article undergoing the process of production. This certainty in the result, and this possibility of interrupting the work are, of course, easier to be attained in the purely mechanical industries than in those in which chemical and physical processes play a part, as, for instance, in the earthenware trade, in bleaching, dyeing, baking, and in most of the metal industry. Wherever there is a working day without restriction as to length, wherever there is night work and unrestricted waste of human life, there the slightest obstacle presented by the nature of the work to a change for the better is soon looked upon as an everlasting barrier erected by nature. No poison kills vermin with more certainty than the Factory Act removes such everlasting barrier. No one made a greater outcry over impossibilities than our friends the earthenware manufacturers. However, they were brought under the Act, and within 16 months every impossibility had vanished. The improved method, called forth by the Act, of making slip by pressure instead of by evaporation, the newly constructed stoves for drying the ware in its green state, and are each events of great importance in the pottery art, and mark an advance which the preceding century could not rival. It has even considerably reduced the temperature of the stoves themselves with a considerable saving of fuel, and with a readier effect on the ware. In spite of every prophecy, the cost price of earthenware did not rise, but the quantity produced did, and to such an extent that the export for the 12 months, ending December, exceeded in value by pound the average of the preceding 3 years. In the manufacture of matches it was thought to be an indispensable requirement that boys, even while bolting their dinner, should go on dipping the matches in melted phosphorus, the poisonous vapor from which rose into their faces. The Factory Act made the saving of time a necessity, and so forced into existence a dipping machine, the vapor from which could not come in contact with the worker. So at the present time, in those branches of the lace manufacture not yet subject to the Factory Act, it is maintained that the meal times cannot be regular owing to the different periods required by the various kinds of lace for drying, which periods vary from 3 minutes up to an hour and more. To this the Children's Employment Commissioners answer, the circumstances of this case are precisely analogous to that of the paper stainers, dealt with in our first report. Some of the principal manufacturers in the trade urge that in consequence of the nature of the materials used, and their various processes, they would be unable, without serious loss, to stop for meal times at any given moment. But it was seen from the evidence that, by due care and previous arrangement, the apprehended difficulty would be got over, and accordingly, by clause of section of the Factory Acts Extension Act, passed during this session of Parliament, an interval of 18 months is given to them from the passing of the Act before they are required to conform to the meal hours specified by the Factory Acts. Hardly had the Act been passed when our friends the manufacturers found out the inconveniences we expected to arise from the introduction of the Factory Acts into our branch of manufacture, I am happy to say, have not arisen. We do not find the production at all interfered with. In short, we produce more in the same time. It is evident that the English legislature, which certainly no one will venture to reproach with being overdosed with genius, has been led by experience to the conclusion that a simple compulsory law is sufficient to enact away all the so-called impediments, opposed by the nature of the process, to the restriction and regulation of the working day. Hence, on the introduction of the Factory Act into a given industry, a period varying from 6 to 18 months is fixed within which it is incumbent on the manufacturers to remove all technical impediments to the working of the Act. Murray Bowes is particularly applicable to modern technology. But though the Factory Acts thus artificially ripen the material elements necessary for the conversion of the manufacturing system into the factory system, yet at the same time, owing to the necessity they impose for greater outlay of capital, they hasten on the decline of the small masters and the concentration of capital. Besides the purely technical impediments that are removable by technical means, the irregular habits of the workpeople themselves obstruct the regulation of the hours of labor. This is especially the case where piece wage predominates, and where loss of time in one part of the day or week can be made good by subsequent overtime, or by night work, a process which brutalizes the adult workman and ruins his wife and children. Although this absence of regularity in the expenditure of labor power is a natural and rude reaction against the tedium of monotonous drudgery, it originates also, to a much greater degree, from anarchy in production. Anarchy that in its turn presupposes unbridled exploitation of labor power by the capitalist. Besides the general periodic changes of the industrial cycle and the special fluctuations in the markets to which each industry is subject, we may also reckon what is called the season, dependent either on the periodicity of favorable seasons of the year for navigation or on fashion, and the sudden placing of large orders that have to be executed in the shortest possible time. The habit of giving such orders becomes more frequent with the extension of railways and telegraphs. The extension of the railway system throughout the country has tended very much to encourage giving short notice. Purchasers now come up from Glasgow, Manchester, and Edinburgh once every fortnight or so to the wholesale city warehouses which we supply, and give small orders requiring immediate execution, instead of buying from stock as they used to do. Years ago we were always able to work in the slack times, so as to meet demand of the next season, but now no one can say beforehand what will be the demand then. In those factories and manufactories that are not yet subject to the Factory Acts, the most fearful overwork prevails periodically during what is called the season, in consequence of sudden order. In the outside department of the factory, of the manufactory, and of the warehouse, the so-called domestic workers, whose employment is at the best irregular, are entirely dependent for their raw material and their orders on the caprice of the capitalist, who, in this industry, is not hampered by any regard for depreciation of his buildings and machinery, and risks nothing by a stoppage of work, but the skin of the worker himself. Here then he sets himself systematically to work to form an industrial reserve force that shall be ready at a moment's notice. During one part of the year he decimates this force by the most inhuman toil, during the other part he lets it starve for want of work.